Module 8, Inborn Errors of Metabolism. So this you've probably seen before when you took Advanced Nutrition 1, where there's a whole host of metabolic pathways that determine our energy balance, our health, how we utilize nutrients, and because there's so many pathways and they're so complex, there's some small probability that a genetic defect can disrupt an enzyme in one or more of these pathways. And when those enzymes get disrupted, almost always in a autosomal recessive manner, that is called an inborn error of metabolism. Inborn errors of metabolism are rare genetic disorders caused by defects in enzymes in biochemical pathways that break down nutrients. They are frequently autosomal recessive, arising from a defect in a single gene, although not always recessive. They can also be dominant. Problems arise from the metabolic accumulation of intermediates, which can cause some toxicity depending upon the intermediate and where it occurs. Of all genetic defects, these can often be effectively treated with dietary intervention, unlike more complex traits. Inborn errors of metabolism occur in energy balance. They occur in pathways that regulate catabolism, they occur in synthesis of proteins and other types of molecules, and they occur in detoxification pathways. Garrett first hypothesized that inborn errors of metabolism arose from defects in genes. What's really significant about this observation is this came really before people were embracing the idea of genes. Mendel's work was just really being accepted scientifically, and this was very intuitive on the part of Garrett, who suggested that these defects that were being observed, which were rare and which were significant and profound metabolic changes, may have occurred from genes. And Garrett was actually one of the very first to propose that there was this one gene, one enzyme hypothesis that was also later embraced by Beadle and Tatum. Not a completely correct, as it turns out, but certainly, intuitive for that time in science. So in 1923, his studies on alkaptonuria, cystinuria, pentosinuria, and albinism were first published in a book called Inborn Errors of Metabolism. Much of Garrett's work was focused on a disease called alkaptonuria. In this case, here's the pathway that you can see as part of the phenylalanine metabolic pathway, in which phenylalanine is converted to tyrosine, and then tyrosine goes down this pathway where it's eventually eliminated as CO2 in water. Because people with this defect lack the enzyme homogentisic acid oxidase, they get a kind of a toxic buildup of homogentisic acid, which actually early on doesn't have much of a phenotype. The most profound phenotype is their urine turns black, but the problem in detecting the defect is that urine must be exposed to oxygen before it will turn black, and so you might not notice that. You might have walked away from the bathroom and not noticed that your urine was black, and it was only through kind of observing urine in babies' diapers that the defect was even identified. Later in life, as you can see from this eye, you do get this buildup of gentisic acid that shows up as colorization of, you can see in eyes and in connective tissue around the eyes. This acid builds up in joints and can cause significant joint pain. And unfortunately, this particular inborn error of metabolism is not easily treated with diet because it is the process of two separate amino acids, which would require significant reduction of protein in order to not have the effects manifested. So often the treatment for this particular disease is simply reducing protein levels but treating symptoms and with anti-inflammatories and other kinds of drugs. So the major categories of inherited metabolic diseases include diseases of carbohydrate metabolism like galactosemia, glucose transport defects, glycogen storage and synthesis defects, and fructose metabolism defects. Diseases of protein metabolism including amino acid metabolism defects, organic acids that accumulate, and urea cycle defects. Diseases of fatty acid metabolism, two of the most common are this medium chain acyl-CoA dehydrogenase defect or deficiency and long chain 3-hydroxyl-CoAse dehydrogenase deficiency. Diseases of mitochondrial metabolism can include defects in carnitine-mediated transport and uptake, and the diseases of peroxisomal metabolism include defects in peroxisome biogenesis and adrenoleukodystrophies. Like any genetic disorder, the biggest risk factor for inborn errors of metabolism is a family history of carrying that trait. And of course, consanguinity or inbreeding increases the probability that recessive defects will come together to manifest a phenotype. So that also increases risk. The prevalence rates of some disorders are higher in certain populations, in part due to founder effects in which the mutation was established within some population that is fairly isolated, and it also has to do with the fact that prevalence or acceptance of consanguinity is different in different populations. The severity of the disorder depends upon which pathway is disrupted and where in the pathway. So the earlier in the metabolic pathway, the more likely the disruption will be significant. Collectively, inborn errors are fairly common, about 1 in 750 to 1,000. But for any individual inborn error of metabolism, they're fairly rare. PKU is the most common inborn error, and it's about 1 in 12,000 kids. Defects, as we said earlier, can lie in enzymes, receptors, transporters, and membrane pumps. So phenylketonuria is one of the most common inborn errors of metabolism, and it results from a defect in the enzyme called phenylalanine hydroxylase, which is the enzyme necessary to process phenylalanine down the pathway towards tyrosine, dopamine, and melanin. Because the individuals with this defect lack that protein, they get a toxic accumulation of phenylalanine, which in the brain, as it turns out, is significant. And these kids, as you can see, this girl, the hypertonicity of limbs is a kind of a key phenotype, and very early onset and very, very severe mental retardation occurs. The great thing about this disease is that when it was finally discovered what was wrong in these kids, it was realized that a diet that was free of phenylalanine, or at least low in phenylalanine, could completely reverse the phenotype. So PKU is always given as one of the best examples of gene-diet interaction, because this is a case in which the genetic defect is completely deterministic. If you don't do anything to change the surroundings, this defect in an enzyme will result in some significant phenotypic alterations. But by simply changing the dietary environment, the outcomes, the kids basically develop normally. and they grow, and when they get past a certain stage of development, they seem to be even less susceptible to phenylalanine than they are during early development. The most recent observations about PKU is that as moms become pregnant, it's been noticed that if they become sort of lax on their PKU diet because they don't really feel any negative effects, they need to really return directly to that diet, because unbeknownst to them, they may have high levels of phenylalanine that will then subsequently affect their offspring. So it is really recommended that they go back on the PKU diet when they become pregnant. So this is an example of what a person with PKU might be eating. You can see that the base of this diet pyramid, is really specialty medical foods that are formulated to eliminate or greatly reduce phenylalanine in the proteins within those particular medical foods. The next stage would be focused on low protein substitutes, low protein types of grains and pastas and cereals, and then fruit and vegetables, of course, and limited amounts of sugars and oils, just like most people should eat. One last thing I wanted to mention about rare disorders is that there's a wonderful database called the NORD, National Organization for Rare Disorders, database of rare diseases. So this is a terrific website where you can go directly and click on the many, many different kinds of inborn errors of metabolism, and you can get a breakdown of the disease itself and the genetic defect when it's known, and strategies for diagnosis and treatment. So in this module, we will cover in more detail an overview of the metabolic diseases that occur from these inborn errors. Can't cover them all in one lesson, but just to give you an overview of the type of defect that might occur, and also to give you an overview of how some of these defects have been treated with nutritional intervention.